The thermometer outside Jack Morrison's cabin read -71 degrees Celsius. In the heart of Alaska's unforgiving wilderness, winter wasn't just cold, it was lethal. Jack had lived alone in this remote corner near Denali for 8 years now, ever since the accident that took his wife Sarah and their unborn child. The isolation suited him. Out here, 30 miles from the nearest town of Talkeetna, grief didn't need explanations. He stood by the frosted window of his log cabin, nursing his third coffee of the morning. At 42, Jack's face carried the weight of someone much older. Deep lines etched around his gray eyes, and his once dark hair had turned almost completely silver. The locals in town called him the hermit, the man who chose solitude over society. Outside, the Alaskan landscape stretched endlessly white and hostile. Jack had learned to respect this land. It demanded respect. One wrong move, one moment of carelessness, and nature would claim you without hesitation. He grabbed his heavy parka, the one with the fur-lined hood, and stepped into the brutal morning. His routine never changed. Check the generator, split firewood, clear the path to the storage shed. Survival out here meant discipline. As he made his way through snow that reached his knees, something caught his attention near the tree line, about 50 yards from his property. A dark shape lay motionless in the snow. Jack's first instinct was to ignore it. Probably a fallen branch, he told himself. But something made him move closer. His boots crunched through the frozen surface, each step an effort against the wind that felt like knives against any exposed skin. As he approached, his heart stopped. It was a baby moose, no more than a few weeks old, lying on its side. The calf's breathing came in shallow, desperate gasps. Its mother was nowhere in sight. Jack knew what that meant out here. Separated from its mother in this cold, the calf had maybe an hour left, probably less. He should walk away. That's what the old Jack would have done. Nature has its course, he'd always believed. The strong survive, the weak perish. It's not cruel, it's just reality. But as he stared down at the helpless creature, something shifted inside him. Those big, terrified eyes looked up at him with a plea he couldn't ignore. The calf tried to stand, its spindly legs shaking violently, before collapsing back into the snow. Without thinking, Jack dropped to his knees. The cold bit through his pants immediately, but he didn't care. He pulled off his gloves and ran his hands over the calf's body. Hypothermia, definitely. The animal's core temperature had dropped dangerously low. His fur was crusted with ice. This is insane, he thought. Moose calves weigh nearly 70 pounds. His cabin was a good distance away. The wind chill was deadly. Every logical part of his brain screamed at him to leave it. But Jack Morrison hadn't felt anything in 8 years except numbness and regret. And now, looking at this fragile life slipping away, he felt something he'd forgotten existed. Purpose. He shrugged off his parka and wrapped it around the shivering calf. Then, with effort that made his back scream in protest, he lifted the animal into his arms. The moose calf was heavier than he expected, dead weight against his chest. Without his parka, the cold attacked him mercilessly. The walk back to his cabin became a battle against time and temperature. His arms burned. His lungs felt like they were freezing from the inside. Frostbite began to nip at his ears and fingers. Twice he almost dropped the calf. Twice, he adjusted his grip and pushed forward. 20 yards felt like 20 miles. When he finally kicked open his cabin door, he was gasping for air. He laid the moose calf on the thick rug in front of his fireplace and immediately stoked the fire higher. The calf's breathing was even shallower now. Its eyes were starting to glaze over. Jack grabbed every blanket he owned and piled them over the small creature. He filled hot water bottles and placed them carefully around the calf's body. His own hands were shaking so badly he could barely grip anything. He'd risked severe frostbite for an animal that would probably die anyway. But as he sat there, rubbing warmth back into the calf's legs, something remarkable happened. The moose's eyes focused on him. Really focused. And in that moment, Jack felt a connection he hadn't experienced since Sarah died. He worked through the night, monitoring the calf's temperature, offering it warm water from a bottle, keeping the fire burning strong. By dawn, The moose calf was standing on wobbly legs, nuzzling against Jack's shoulder. He'd saved a life, and somehow, in doing so, he'd found a small piece of his own soul he thought was lost forever. Jack named the moose calf Scout. Over the next 3 weeks, the animal became his constant companion. Scout followed him everywhere, from the woodshed to the generator, even trying to squeeze through doorways to stay close. The calf's strength returned remarkably fast, and soon the cabin echoed with sounds Jack hadn't heard in years. Life, movement, purpose beyond mere survival. But reality was creeping in, and Jack knew it. Scout was growing rapidly. What started as a 70-pound calf was now pushing past 120. The cabin felt smaller each day. More concerning, Scout needed to be wild. This wasn't a pet. This was a wild animal that belonged in the wilderness, not in a human's living room. The breaking point came on a bitter February morning. Jack woke to find Scout had knocked over his entire food supply. Flour, rice, canned goods scattered across the floor. The moose stood in the middle of the chaos, looking almost apologetic, but Jack's heart sank for a different reason. His supplies were meant to last until the spring thaw when he could make the trek into Talkeetna. Now he had maybe 2 weeks of food left. The roads were impassable. The temperatures were still hovering around -50. Going to town meant a dangerous 30-mile journey on his snowmobile through terrain that had killed experienced outdoorsmen. He had no choice. That afternoon, Jack loaded his snowmobile with emergency supplies. Scout watched from the cabin window, those big eyes tracking his every movement. Jack's hands trembled as he secured the last strap. It wasn't just about the dangerous journey ahead. It was about leaving Scout alone again. The trip to Talkeetna was a nightmare. Whiteout conditions hit 5 miles in. Jack could barely see 3 feet ahead. The cold was so intense that his goggles kept fogging and freezing. Twice, the snowmobile nearly tipped navigating hidden ice patches. When he finally reached the general store in Talkeetna, Tom Hendricks, the owner, barely recognized him. "You look like hell, Morrison." Jack didn't argue. He bought what he needed and prepared for the return journey, dreading it even more than the trip in. What Jack didn't know was that back at the cabin, Scout was pacing anxiously by the door. And in the tree line beyond Jack's property, something else was watching. Something that had been tracking the scent of the young moose for days. A pack of 5 wolves, hungry and desperate in the brutal winter. The journey back was worse than Jack feared. Night had fallen, and in Alaska's winter, darkness was absolute. His headlight cut a narrow beam through the swirling snow, but visibility was nearly zero. The cold had seeped so deep into his bones that he'd lost feeling in his feet miles ago. He was still 8 miles from home when the snowmobile engine sputtered, then died. Jack's stomach dropped. He tried the ignition once, twice, 3 times. Nothing. The fuel line had frozen. Out here, stranded in -60 degrees with night closing in, this was a death sentence. He had 2 choices. Stay with the snowmobile and hope someone found him before hypothermia took him, or start walking. 8 miles in these conditions. Impossible odds. Jack thought of Scout waiting at the cabin. That moose had survived against impossible odds too. He started walking. Each step was agony. The wind fought him like a living thing. His supply pack felt like it weighed 300 pounds. After 2 miles, he couldn't feel his hands anymore despite the gloves. After 4, he started hallucinating, seeing Sarah's face in the swirling snow. Keep moving, he told himself. Just keep moving. Meanwhile, at the cabin, the wolves had grown bold. They circled the property, their yellow eyes gleaming in the darkness. Scout sensed them. The young moose paced frantically inside, that primal instinct screaming danger. The alpha wolf, a massive gray beast with a scarred muzzle, approached the cabin door. Could smell the moose inside. Easy prey. Trapped. If you're hoping Jack makes it back in time, take a moment and think about subscribing to the channel. Because what happens next will change everything for both of them. Jack was now 6 miles in, barely conscious, when he saw lights in the distance. Not his cabin. Too far west. Confusion clouded his mind. Then he realized. The Kowalski Ranch. His nearest neighbors, 12 miles away normally, but he'd veered off course in the whiteout. He stumbled toward the lights, falling twice before rough hands caught him. Bill Kowalski's weathered face swam into view. "Good God, Morrison. Get him inside," Bill shouted to his son. They dragged Jack into their heated barn. Margaret Kowalski wrapped him in blankets while Bill radioed for help. But Jack kept mumbling the same thing through his frost-cracked lips. "Scout, the wolves. Have to get home." Bill Kowalski understood immediately. He'd lived in Alaska long enough to know what a wolf pack could do. 20 minutes later, Jack was bundled into Bill's heavy-duty pickup truck, the kind built for impossible conditions. Bill's son, Danny, rode in the back with a hunting rifle. The drive to Jack's cabin took 40 agonizing minutes. Jack's mind raced with horrific images. Scout torn apart, blood in the snow, all because he'd tried to save supplies instead of staying put. When they finally reached the property, the headlights illuminated a scene from a nightmare. 5 wolves surrounded the cabin. The alpha was at the door, scratching, testing the wood. Inside, they could hear Scout's panicked calls. The young moose was throwing itself against the walls in terror. Bill didn't hesitate. He laid on the horn. The sound shattered the night. The wolves turned, eyes glowing in the headlights. For a moment, they held their ground. Then Danny fired a warning shot into the air. The pack scattered into the tree line, but Jack knew they wouldn't go far. Not with prey so close. He stumbled from the truck and crashed through his cabin door. Scout nearly knocked him over, the moose pressing against him, trembling violently. Jack wrapped his arms around the animal's neck, and for the first time since Sarah died, tears ran down his face. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I left you." Bill and Danny spent the night at the cabin, keeping watch. The wolves prowled the perimeter until dawn, their shadows visible against the snow. But they never attacked again. As sunrise painted the Alaskan sky in shades of pink and gold, Jack sat by the fire with Scout's head resting in his lap. Bill poured coffee and spoke quietly. "That moose saved your life, you know. If you hadn't been trying to get back to him, you'd have stayed with that snowmobile. You'd be dead." Jack looked down at Scout. The realization hit him hard. He'd saved this creature's life in the cold. And in return, Scout had given him a reason to survive the impossible journey home. But the bigger truth was even more profound. For 8 years, Jack had been dead inside, just going through the motions of living. Scout hadn't just needed him. Jack had needed Scout even more. Spring came slowly to Alaska, but when it arrived, it transformed everything. The brutal whites and grays gave way to explosions of green. Wildflowers dotted the meadows. The sound of melting ice filled the air like music. Scout had grown massive, nearly 300 pounds now, with the beginnings of antler buds on his head. He was becoming what he was always meant to be, a wild moose, strong, independent, magnificent. Jack knew what he had to do. On a warm May morning, he opened the cabin door wide and stepped outside. Scout followed as always, but this time Jack kept walking toward the tree line, toward the vast wilderness that stretched for hundreds of miles. When they reached the edge of his property, Jack stopped. Scout looked at him with those same eyes that had pleaded for help months ago in the snow. But now they held something different. Understanding. "Go on," Jack whispered, his voice breaking. "You don't belong here with me. You belong out there." Scout didn't move. Jack picked up a stick and threw it into the forest. Scout watched it fall but stayed rooted to the spot. Jack's heart was shattering. He'd known this moment would come, prepared himself for it, but nothing could make it easier. He turned and walked back toward the cabin, refusing to look back. Each step felt like betrayal. Behind him, he heard Scout's call, that distinctive sound young moose make. It took everything Jack had not to turn around. He reached his porch and finally allowed himself to look. Scout was gone. Jack sank onto the steps, his face in his hands. The grief was overwhelming, but different from the grief he'd carried for 8 years. This wasn't the hollow, dead feeling of loss. This was the sharp, painful, but somehow beautiful ache of letting go, of loving something enough to set it free. Days passed, then weeks. Jack fell back into his routine, but the cabin felt emptier than it ever had before. He told himself this was right. Scout was wild now, living the life he was meant to live. Then, on a quiet June evening, as Jack sat on his porch watching the sunset, he heard something at his gate. He looked up, and his breath caught in his throat. Scout stood at the gate, but he wasn't alone. Beside him was a female moose, slightly smaller, with gentle eyes. And between them, wobbling on uncertain legs, was a tiny calf, no more than a few days old. Jack rose slowly from the porch, afraid to breathe, afraid this was a dream. Scout made that familiar sound, the one Jack had heard 1,000 times during their winter together. But now it was deeper, mature, the call of a fully grown bull moose. Scout approached the fence, his massive head lowering. Jack reached out with trembling hands and touched the moose's muzzle, just like he had that first morning when he'd saved him from the cold. "You came back?" Jack whispered. "You actually came back." The female moose kept her distance, protective of her calf, but she didn't run. Scout had brought his family to meet the man who'd given him a second chance at life. For 20 minutes, they stood there together. Jack talked to Scout like he had during those long winter nights, telling him about the garden he'd started, about how he'd been thinking of getting a dog for company, about the small changes happening in his heart. Then Scout turned, nudging his mate and calf back toward the forest. But before disappearing into the trees, he looked back one final time. And in that look, Jack saw everything. Gratitude, recognition, love. 2 years later, Jack Morrison was a different man. His cabin had expanded. He'd built a workshop where he carved wooden sculptures that he sold in Talkeetna. He'd started volunteering at the local wildlife rescue. And he'd begun dating again, a wildlife biologist named Rachel who understood his love for this harsh, beautiful land. Every few months, Scout returned to the gate. Sometimes alone, sometimes with his family. The herd had grown. Jack had counted 4 calves last visit. On the anniversary of the day he'd found Scout in the snow, Jack stood at his gate and looked out at the wilderness. Sarah would have loved this story, he thought. She would have loved knowing that saving one life had somehow saved his 2. The hermit of Denali wasn't a hermit anymore. And it all started the day he chose compassion over isolation in -71 degrees. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your own experiences with unexpected connections in the comments below. What moment changed your life? We'd love to hear your story. Until next time, remember that sometimes the life you save might just be your own.